We noticed recently when we were talking last about this that it's actually 25 years really since what we can sort of find a beginning to the Limerick feud in 2000. But so 2.5 decades ago, it really all kicked off down in Limerick. And we're going to talk about it, how it got to that starting point maybe, and what happened over those 25 years. And we're going to bring it up to date to where we're at now. But bring us back, Eamon, to what you see. I suppose before we start at 2000, we go a little bit further back to the origins of this, because nothing sort of starts in a flash, does it?
No, I mean, I suppose everyone kind of sees 2000 as the year the Limerick feud began, because there was the high-profile murder of Eddie Ryan in the Moose Bar, but there is a backstory to that, and you could even go back as far as 1983, as it's when the different factions were kind of
83 or 93?
No, 83.
Really?
And it's when the different factions were kind of cementing their reputations and their, laying down their cards as hard men, and started to control their own area of the drug business at the time. And then you had sort of the various kind of personalities clashing.
Yeah.
And then as you went towards 2000, you had the economy picking up.
Yeah.
I mean, the economy was a runaway in 1996. So you have a lot of money sloshing around, a lot of drugs being sold. And suddenly these guys have gone from being small-time street dealers to international players. And that's when the killing starts.
And that's when they really line up. So what was Limerick like in 83? And did the city have a heroin problem like Dublin?
It didn't have a heroin problem as such, but it did have a problem in terms of its reputation. It was unfortunately known as Stab City at the time, and it did have a reputation for violence. There was Patrick McCarthy was stabbed to death in 1983, and he had gone to Christy Keane's house looking for money because a relative of his had been killed by a relative of Keane's by accident. I think was hit by a van, but had come back too many times looking for his compensation, so to speak. And Christy Keane is suspected of the man. Well, he was actually named by various witnesses who then, when it came to trial, changed the story or didn't say what would happen. Patrick McCarthy was stabbed. He died outside Christy Keane's house. And then on the night of his funeral, there was two men went into a caravan of the McCarthy families and opened fire and shot 7 people and killed his brother Michael McCarthy.
What?
So Keane had established himself as a very dangerous player.
And what age was he at that stage? Is he in his 20s, Christy Keane? Probably.
Yeah, he would have been, obviously, yeah. I mean, he's 60 something now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it would have been at the beginning, like, I mean, the family were involved in the coal business and stuff like that and working as delivery people. And, they wouldn't necessarily have had a reputation as being hard men or being involved in crime. But this certainly established Christy Keane as a leading figure in, I suppose, the nascent Limerick underworld at that point.
And where are the Keanes living at this stage?
This is the island field that we've spoken about before, Edith Street and the other, it's a kind of and it literally is an island. It's surrounded on 3 sides by, I suppose.
Quite strange. Was it an old army facility or something?
It was originally built, I think it was local authority. It is a local authority estate, but it was, I forget the reason now why it was originally built, but it was meant, I think, for, was it even retired Free State soldiers or something like that at the time? But anyway, it was taken over by the Limerick Corporation at the time. And, it would have been kind of a good place to live, I'm sure. Like all those estates, I suppose it was the first kind of decent housing, and for a lot of these cities at the time. So you would have had the Colopy family were in the island field as well.
Right.
And Jack Colopy, the dad, like, he was again, there was a kind of I suppose, animosity between him and members of the Ryan family. And, and the reasons for this, it's some of it's to do with women, female relatives that were fighting, and that the men were kind of drawn into this. And Jack Colopy was seriously assaulted. There was 3 men, including John Ryan and another unrelated man also called Patrick McCarthy, who's not related to the one we just mentioned, who was stabbed in 1983. And the Ryans then took it upon themselves to kind of avenge this, and began feuding with people that they felt were connected with Ryan or this particular McCarthy family, who are nothing to do with what we will be talking to later about the McCarthy Dundons. They're a different family again.
But from this point of time, we have the Keane Collopys both living in the island field. Are they aligned?
No, they would have been considered kind of separate groups at this stage. And even now, like, they're still considered separate organised crime gangs. But at that stage, they wouldn't necessarily have been, deliberately aligned. If anything, the Keanes were aligned with the Ryans. Eddie Ryan, John's brother, was very much his enforcer. And they were the two men suspected of carrying out the shooting in the McCarthy caravan.
Right.
Like, it was Eddie Ryan and Christy Keane. So they were quite close. And it got to the point then when we're getting closer to this kind of attack in 2000 when Eddie Ryan is shot dead. And really what that was about, as John Ryan was increasing his feud with the Collopys, and as the Collopys were, I suppose there was various different kind of incidents, like there was women being threatened, it was kind of attack each other on sight sort of situation. So there was constant kind of... there was a constant tension, and Eddie Ryan got to the point where I suppose it was also a factor behind it was the fact that the burgeoning drugs business at this stage was really starting to kick in, and you might have thought, why should I be working for someone else, and I can solve a problem then. I keep my family members who are feuding with the Keanes on side as well. And he went to shoot Christy Keane as he was doing a school run, and Christy Keane ran down the window thinking his friend was coming up to speak to him, who then pulled a gun, and only for it jammed and didn't go off. He escaped. So he wasn't shot. He tore off down the street in high speed, by all accounts. And then there was shots then exchanged, I think in October, that we're up to 2000 now. And so there were shots, say, exchanged between members of the Ryan family and the Keane Tracys. So, they were like driving around looking at trying to shoot each other at this stage. In the meantime, in June of that year, before anything started, the Dundons have moved back from London. So, have the likes of Wayne Dundon and John Dundon, and they're already kind of making their presence felt, not necessarily in the gangland. They're not necessarily kind of well known, certainly in the wider media at this stage, but they're kind of getting involved in sort of trying to intimidate prison officers, intimidating guards, involved in a number of nasty assaults at this stage. But they're actually quietly building up their own transnational drugs gang, as it turns out. And the
Dundons were quite young, because wasn't Wayne essentially like put out of England because he had, under some order, he had been involved in some horrendous violence in the UK. Both his parents, of course, came from Limerick, married, went to the UK, and had they 5 boys and 1 girl?
Yeah, something like that. 5 boys, 1 girl. And Wayne was an aggravated burglary in the south of England, and I think it was a lady in a wheelchair that was assaulted, and it was pretty nasty. And he got a lengthy enough sentence, and then was basically, barred from England at that stage. So they were back. They're first cousins of the McCarthys, not the people originally from the island field, but I suppose the Moy Ross McCarthys is a different family altogether.
So by 2000, then you have the Ryans, the McCarthys, and the Dundons sort of merging, yeah?
Yeah, and in the background then you have some serious characters, which I quickly go through. So you have Sean Cowboy Hanley, Jim Chaser O'Brien, and Anthony Kelly from Kilrush. And those guys would have been, I suppose, the businessmen. The likes of Hanley, may or may not have had connections with paramilitaries. Chaser O'Brien was from a middle-class family with a business experience. Anthony Kelly was another man with business experience, but also a conviction for running a mobile brothel with mattresses in the back of the van. So you've guys who are, I suppose, more switched on and able to move money, I guess, at that stage. And, the Dundons were, I suppose, the perfect kind of counterbalance to kind of the guys who didn't want to get their hands dirty, like on the streets, doing all the kind of the money collection, the actual selling and making sure their people dealing for them stay in line. So they were quietly developing into a really serious criminal outfit, while the Ryans and the Keanes are going at each other.
Is there kind of opportunities missed then? I mean, what we learned from all of this was just sort of, I suppose, these smaller incidents of women fighting, of, fire, maybe guns fired at houses, all this are now seen as being possible kind of forerunners to a feud. But I don't think back then anybody would have known that, or maybe they weren't taking some of the smaller incidents as serious as...
I actually think they were, and like even going through this, like it's amazing to see that for most of the feuding that was going on, Wayne Dundon was in prison for all about 5 years. Like Christy Keane was in prison for 7 years of it. John Dundon was in and out of prison on a regular basis. There was some of the key players were either on the run then in Europe as well. I mean, the likes of Chaser O'Brien took off in the early days. Now, he wouldn't have been the kind of person necessarily touting a gun, but I suppose what continued to drive it was the fact that the drugs are being sold, and we're into kind of the really fast moving economy of the Celtic Tigers now, the year 2000, and there's young builders who are getting £1,000 a week, and they're buying cocaine every Friday night.
Cocaine comes in, and we see that across the country by 2000. Really, it's the kind of the cold cocaine gold rush starts. Up to that point, we said there wasn't a problem with heroin as such in the city. It was cannabis they were selling, was it?
Yeah, and again, it would have been cannabis, but then it became cocaine. Like the same as everywhere, I guess, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the drug of choice, is the drug of choice of the middle class and anyone, who had a few bob. So it wasn't just the middle class anymore. And that was the difference. I mean, at one time it would have been the media types and the political types in the seedy city centre Dublin late bars and nightclubs that would have been doing their cocaine, and because no one else could really afford it. And so Limerick, like everywhere else, like every big town in Ireland was starting to see the first ebbing of the first flow of the white powder coming from South America as production ramped up, or the American market was saturated, so it was arriving here.
So you have two things going on really for Limerick, that is that sort of bubbling undercurrent of personal feuding, and look, Christy Keane winds down his window and there's an attempt at shooting on him. When you have a kind of a kingpin like that, or somebody at the top of his game like that, the fact of the matter is it's kill or be killed, isn't it? I mean, these are fatal, when it doesn't work, it can cause ripple effects that go on for decades, similar to what we saw in the Regency Hotel. The Hutch organisation didn't get Daniel Kinahan, but the repercussions of that went on and still go on. So 2000, we have the Dundon family returning and beginning to set up that gang with Hanley, O'Brien and Kelly as sort of suppliers and business people behind them.
They were kind of, I mean, their names wouldn't come out for years, like from our point of view, but we weren't aware of them for years. And you often wondered, like, how were these street thugs becoming so successful, and how did they, no one's an overnight success, but they seem to be some kind of an overnight kind of like heavyweight arrival on the crime scene in Limerick. So I mean, there was always this kind of a shadowy scene, no more than the so-called Munster Mafia, that these guys who are quietly tipping away at being international criminals, flogging a huge amount of drugs, sourcing it directly from the brokers in Amsterdam or in Spain or wherever they were getting it at that point. And making business, making money as business people, and the commodity were cannabis and cocaine, and ecstasy obviously was a big thing still at that point. So they were
feeding it down through the system to these gangs who were ambitious and whatever. And you have sort of the ambition, I suppose, there of the Dundons with their cousins, the McCarthys, and you have then this ongoing bubbling feud between the Ryans and the Keane Tracys.
Yeah, and then, of course, it boiled over then after Eddie Ryan pointed the gun that failed to go off. And that was 2 days later then, on, I think it was 12th of November that year, 2000, he was sitting in the Moose Bar with one of his sons, who went to the toilet, and a person walked in with a machine gun, opened up and killed him. And luckily enough, there were other people injured. His son totally escaped, but he probably would have been shot as well.
So he literally came back from the loo to find that this had sort of gone off.
Of carnage, like, in the pub, absolute panic, presumably full of gun smoke.
Right.
And the suspects, involved in that, it was very much considered that it was Kieran Keane and Philip Colopy, who we'll hear more of later. And they were considered the two men who'd gone into the pub. There was another man who was driving the car outside who was convicted of that, but Keane and Colopy were never convicted of that murder of Eddie Ryan. But
why would Colopy have put skin in the game then? Did he see an alliance with Keane as being more satisfactory than the Ryans taking over?
They were already feuding with the Ryans. So the fact that Eddie Ryan had made a choice and tried to kill Christy Keane, there was no more fence for Christy Keane to sit on. There was no reason to protect his enforcer or to stay doing business with Eddie Ryan. They were enemies.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they were natural allies because they were both fighting with the Ryans. So therefore,
that brought them together.
My enemy's enemy is my friend, and it was as simple as that. It was just the simple mechanics of two gangland figures that their interests aligned.
And how big a story was the Eddie Ryan shot in the Moose bar? I mean, it's a very public place, and I'm sure it was quite terrifying.
Well, I mean, it's unusual. Like that type of murder, we'd only have associated with paramilitary sort of activity before. Like, somebody opening up on a machine gun in a crowded bar. It's something, like Loughlin Island or it's, I suppose a couple of years before that you'd had Jerry McCabe shot dead. But again, that was, provisional IRA gunmen had carried out that murder in Adair in Limerick. So for basically a drugs gang to be involved, it's... there was an element, I guess, of confusion. I'm sure the local Gardaí knew exactly what was going on and were probably sick of telling their superiors, "I told you so."
Yeah.
And they were like, when we get into it, like we're fairly scratched the surface, but there is a constant underlying level of low intensity violence constantly happening, stabbings, threats to kill, arson attacks. Attempts at intimidating, everybody from social welfare officers to prison officers to Gardaí. All of this is going on. I mean, some of the recent cab cases that have come up with some of the Limerick people, I've noticed there's a paragraph that's been used in different affidavits, and it's also been used. It's not word for word the same, but the gist of it is the same. It's also been used in a bail hearing, I think, with Red Larry McCarthy years and years after this. And basically, the feud can be summarised as 19 murders, 15 attempted murders, 38 firearm seizures, 35 explosive seizures, and 2,000 rounds of ammunition seized, which, I think is the very minimum of what went on. I mean, they characterise kind of 19 murders. That's, the figure we use. But there's other people that they're not considered as feud murders, like there's like young Richie Kelly. He was basically a joyrider. He's a young kind of tearaway with a criminal record. But he disappeared. His body wasn't found for 2 years, and the theory was that he'd stolen a car that may or may not have had drugs in it that belonged to one of the gang. And of course, he didn't realise that. And whatever they did with the car, the drugs were lost, and he was murdered. And that's the theory. And he was. I think he was sunk in a lake. It's a horrible kind of a horrible end for a young man who wasn't involved in the feud violence. And you had like Daniel Tracy. It's a delivery man shot dead. Again, this is, I think, a 20, it's nearly 10 or more years later. But he was related to someone who was involved in feud violence. And, even though he had nothing to do with it, he paid with his life, for being connected as well. So you have, so you have all, these are kind of, I suppose, the pinnacle kind of incidents where someone is murdered. But at the back of it, you have constant, if somebody's going shopping or going to collect their social welfare, they're getting harassed, they're getting beaten up or attacked. And there's loads of these going on all the time. So the guards are flat out, they're busy.
A huge amount of knife crime. So after Eddie Ryan is shot dead, is there a sense that the Keane Colopys are the kings, that Kieran Keane and Philip Colopy rule Limerick? I remember, at that stage, Christy Keane was seen as the big guy. He was the number one man in Limerick. That he was,
unaware as we were of the likes of Chaser O'Brien and Cowboy Hanley and Kelly Kilrush, we kind of saw Christy Keane as the smart man, like as the kind of the pinnacle of the underworld in Limerick at that stage. But his control was, I suppose, just his own business, so to speak, and that there wasn't a great, I suppose, it wasn't a single market and it wasn't a single gang. He certainly did not control all of Limerick at the time, whereas we might have thought he was the main man. But now we know, it was a far more kind of fractured and kind of, there was more of a mosaic of different people operating at the time, some of whose names have again only come to light when you talk about some of the people like that, again, who've been named in various cab cases in the last couple of years. You kind of see that there was a whole, I suppose, layer of people like, the shadowy people with the business experience who were lurking in the background, and they were there all along.
So in the aftermath of Eddie Ryan's murder, what happens next, or what's the kind of the next?
Well, like for instance, some of the low level incidents we're talking about. So in December that year, you had Brian Phillip and Kieran Colopy attack Frog Eye Stanners, who you'll hear of more later, and Kieran Rashers Ryan, who was the son of Eddie, and there was a fight in the reception area of Limerick Prison. So in the visitors' reception area. So that's one thing. Like, you had John Ryan's wife. She was attacked and threatened by Brian Colopy and Philip Colopy on a street. John Ryan, is a brother of Eddie. So again, this is still going on. You have likes of, then unrelated to the feud. Cowboy Hanley's son Brian is stabbed to death in a pub row where he was kind of trying to have a go at somebody and came off second best. And then in actually what was kind of quite important, I think, in terms of raising the profile of the Limerick gangs, in August that year, Liam Keane, who was 17 at the time, he's the son of Christy Keane, he fatally stabbed a chap called Eric Leamy in the Lee estate. And it's a little bit later after that then. I don't know if you remember the picture of him walking out with giving the finger to the cameraman. And basically the trial that was brought against him completely collapsed because, as Judge Carney called it, it was a case of collective amnesia. Everyone forgot what they had told the guards and said, no, that's not right, and they didn't see anything that happened. So
witness intimidation. Was there juries? They were before jury trials then?
There was as well, and there was one case, I can't remember which one it was now, but it was kind of seen as a failure that they had to bring it to Dublin, to Clover Hill. It was obviously one of the ones with either John or Wayne Dundon. I think it could have been the Roy Collins one. They couldn't hold it in Limerick on the basis that of I think something like 250 people that had been selected as jury pool were, came up with a reason why they couldn't do it.
They were terrified.
So they were terrified, and understandably so. And it was moved to Clover Hill, and it was held in tight security there. But the sentencing was brought back to Limerick. I think that was the point that the state were trying to make at the time, that they're still in charge.
And ultimately, the state would start looking at the Special Criminal Court as being a necessary entity to hear these cases, because you didn't have access to juries. It was a 3-judge court, and they would eventually, but it will take a while for those cases, for the Gangland case, to start coming up in the Special Criminal Court. So Liam Keane, sort of, this trial falls apart. All the while, the sales of drugs are keeping it all financed, and it's the wheels that's keeping it all going. And Limerick is a lucrative market. It's a successful town where, like everywhere else, people are taking cocaine at weekends and during the week, and they want to buy drugs. And Brian Fitzgerald is a guy who comes up into the story then. He is a bouncer, I think, on a bar. Yeah,
he was head of security at Doc's nightclub. And he barred Red Larry McCarthy, John and Desi Dundon, because he didn't want drug dealers in the place. And so they didn't take kindly to this. It didn't take long. It was a couple of weeks. In December that year, there was warning shots fired into his house. There was threats made to him, and he gave a statement to the guards. So the kind of, it ramped up the intimidation against Fitzgerald. He gave evidence at a High Court bail hearing. About that he feared for his life and all the rest. And now the case, there was. The case eventually didn't go ahead, and it was Brian Fitzgerald did actually withdraw his statement that the intimidation got so intense that there was people close to him saying, telling him it's such a bad idea. Like, he was known to have had, like we do know that Larry McCarthy seemed to be obsessed with this. He absolutely hated him and blamed him for putting him behind bars. It just went on, and it must have been absolutely torturous for him. And we kind of,
you can feel the rule of law beginning to collapse here.
Yeah, and it's unraveling, like in one sense. And at the same time, you've had, don't forget now, Christy Keane has been arrested. He's been caught with €250,000 worth of cannabis. And so in June of that year, so while this intimidation from the McCarthy Dundons is being kind of focused at Brian Fitzgerald, Christy Keane gets a 10-year prison sentence in June of that year.
In 2003.
So in 2002.
Yeah.
So now we're looking at, like, one of the main players is out of the game. So surely things are going to calm down a bit. But unfortunately, Brian Fitzgerald then is then murdered in November that year. He's shot dead outside his home. They had spotters outside the nightclub. They waited for him to come home. Like, he kind of stood up to them, but realized they had a gun. And he was shot a number of times. And there was such an outcry. There was a huge outcry because he was seen as, a totally innocent person, and that these guys were, the gangsters were kind of ruling the roost, and that the state were powerless, the guards were powerless, judiciary were powerless really to do much about it. Interestingly enough, like we will later learn that an English guy, James Martin Cahill, was contracted to do the killing. And there was a courier who was kind of coerced into bringing over drugs and guns for the Dundons at this stage, a guy called Philip Dean. And he's arrested, and kind of he immediately talks to the guards and more or less tells them everything he knows. But we'll find then again as it goes on, he also caves into the intimidation. But the key then, Martin Cahill is a way back in for the guards at one point. So I think it takes until
was James Martin Cahill arrested?
He's got away clean.
Okay.
So but the Philip Dean, or presumably it's Philip Dean or someone else, has the guards know of James Martin Cahill's involvement at this stage. And then he's under surveillance in Dublin the following March. He's back. And the theory was he was out to kill Decky Griffin. If you remember, he was a Clondalkin-based drug dealer. And so Cahill is obviously he's not trying to, he's offering the services of a professional hitman. And he's caught with 2 Uzi submachine guns. They were kind of the, reactivated guns, but arrested by the special branch near Rathcoole. And he would eventually get 5 years in the special criminal court for that. And of course, becomes paranoid and thinks that the Dundons are going to kill him, which is quite possible that they were. And we think there was actually a plot to buy an RPG, rocket propelled grenade, that they were going to attack his prison cell in Portlaoise or the Midlands.
How are they going to get that in?
Well, there you go. But luckily enough, it was an undercover British agent, I think from MI5 or whatever it was, who was the seller. But I remember at the time doing stories about James Martin Cahill. The reason I'm pronouncing his name is so we don't mix him up with the general.
Yes.
Anyway, James Cahill, the Birmingham guy, who had some kind of petty violence or whatever convictions, but did have connections to Ireland. There were family members, but again, we'll learn the Dundons and the McCarthys are to call them a Limerick gang is too narrow. They're around the place. There's as many. They have as much contact in Birmingham and Manchester as they do in Limerick.
Is that because the Dundons sort of grew up in the UK and made connections before they came back? Or are they just dealing with other drug gangs and, sourcing obviously killers and weapons and drugs from the UK?
It's all of the above.
Yeah.
They always had those connections. When they first came back to Ireland in 2000, they brought it with them. I mean, the mother, Anne McCarthy, is a McCarthy, so
yes,
they're a much bigger clan. Some members that we will know were involved in serious criminality at quite a high level. So I mean, they have all those contacts. So they're not nobodies. To use a double negative.
No, they're not. I mean, we're only on 2002 here, and they have, we've said, only moved back really at the turn of the century. So they're only really 3 years in the country.
Yeah,
and they're flying a UK contract killer in. There's intimidation going on. They're attacking the very sort of foundations of the state already.
Yeah, I mean they're totally confident and arrogant in their approach, and it's a real kind of shock and awe of the underworld that nobody's going to stand up to them, that they're all powerful. I mean, even if the likes of Liam Keane can stab somebody in broad daylight in front of witnesses and get away with it, like, you know, the Dundons are another magnitude again in terms of their ability to intimidate people, and even like, you know, there's. Even outside of the drug business, like in January 2003, there's a car dealer, an innocent man, Sean Poland. He was shot dead. He opened the door and he was immediately, without hesitation, shot by a gunman because he had sold a car to a member of the McCarthy Dundons earlier that day. So they went back to steal the money and shot him in the gut, tied up his girlfriend, who was able to free herself. But by the time she got out and raised the alarm, it was too late. He had basically bled to death, died, agonized, presumably an unpleasant death after being shot in the stomach, and left there. And so, I mean, that's just January 2003.
And before we move on, a name has kind of come up in this, a guy called Gary Campion, and he turns out he's the getaway driver in the murder of Brian Fitzgerald. But he's the classic kind of soldier that these gangs are finding within those deprived housing estates of Limerick, built, I suppose, in the same way a lot of estates were built in Dublin and elsewhere to sort of to negate the problem of people living in tenements, essentially. So, you know, there's this huge need for social housing. Big estates are built. The services aren't sort of put in around them. You've got high levels of unemployment, of, you know, maybe alcoholism and other things like that happening within the community. And you're getting these young men coming of age who are seeing opportunities and careers within this new gangland, fueled by the millions being pumped into that system through middle-class drug use.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, Gary Campion, his brother Noel Campion, again, a fairly notorious figure who, you know, meets an untimely end, as did, you know, Fat Frankie Ryan, who was, you know, part of, you know, the Dundon setup as well. And there were just, you know, there was any amount of people willing to get involved. Because, I mean, you know, it was to some extent, for some of them, it was kill or be killed. But it was also a way of making money.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was a career option for them.
It was a serious career option. And there was plenty of money to be made. You know, for the people who are willing to kind of tough it out and, you know, were useful to the gangs. But I suppose we're getting kind of to the point where I suppose where it really hit the headlines then. Like we're in January 2003, and you have Eddie Ryan's two sons. Now, Eddie Ryan was shot dead in the Moose Bar. So his sons, Kieran and Eddie Jr., are walking along the street with Christopher Smokey Costello. And a van pulls up and they're bundled in, and Smokey Costello is left to tell the tale about the kidnap of the two Ryan brothers. And there's serious, there's serious concern for their well-being. They've assumed that this is the Keanes have struck again, that they've, you know, got revenge. You know, they're wiping out the Ryans.
They've killed the father, and that they want to wipe out the two sons in case they come back.
Exactly, yeah. And so this has gone on for a couple of days, and then you know the story as well.
It's incredible.
But it is an incredible story. And so then you have Kieran Keane, a brother of Christy Keane, and Owen Tracy, his nephew. They're basically invited to a house to come and view either the bodies of the two Ryan boys or to come and watch their execution. And this is going to be done on their behalf by the McCarthy Dundons. So they turn up, and they're immediately a gun pulled on them. They're tied up. They're put into a van. There's attempts. They're brought to another location. There's attempts to lure Brian Colopy to meet them as well. They know what's going on. And eventually they're brought outside of the city. And Kieran Keane is shot dead. The gun jams. And Owen Tracy then is stabbed 17 times and left for dead. And shortly after that, then the two Ryan boys make a miraculous reappearance. They claim that they were held in Portlaoise. Turns out we believe they were staying in a house in Thurles all the time. And they're there's a celebration at these guys, surviving their ordeal. And eventually then, I mean, it takes a while to untangle it. But we know that there's now been a double cross, that this was actually an attempt by the McCarthy Dundons to decapitate the kind of, I suppose, the leadership of the Keane gang with Christy Keane in prison. they kill his brother and come close to killing his nephew.
And how does Kieran Keane and Owen Tracy trust the Dundons to go meet them? I suppose this kind of double cross has never come on their radar before. They believe that the Dundons are pretty convincing, obviously.
Yeah, well, I suppose their focus is the Ryans. And they are worried that, Kieran and Eddie Jr. are going to have a go at them. We've had, the fight in the prison already at this stage. So, I mean, it's a live threat for them. And as 2003 went on then, there was a couple of other high-profile incidents. There was this really violent fight outside a restaurant. There's a fast food restaurant on the Ennis Road. And there was 9 people eventually jailed over that. Ray Colopy was one of those. And this is the rival factions. I think it was the Garda Sub-Aqua unit were on the way back from some operation and stopped off to get burgers and chips, and were the people who had to intervene. That probably somebody would have been killed.
And this was a chance, kind of. They all happened to be in the same kind of fast food restaurant, and it kicks off.
And this is going on all the time.
Yeah,
but on this occasion, there happened to be a Garda unit, albeit an unusual one.
Yeah,
they happened to be presumably big enough, tough guys that they were able to kind of sort this out.
Yeah,
and the arrests were made and backup brought in, and there was, I think that at the time, there was a huge trial, and it took quite a while, and it cost something like €250,000 at the time to go through all this, and they all got reasonable sentences, 5 and 6 and 7 years. So you have people are constantly being locked up, so it wasn't like the guards weren't able to keep. Weren't able to not necessarily keep a lid on the
sometimes they were getting lucky, and it was sort of firefighting though, policing, wasn't it?
It was
that attitude of, you jail them for a couple of years, keeps them off the streets, calms the situation down, you're kind of breaking up these cell structures. The Colopys and the Keanes, Christy Keane is left after his brother is killed and Owen Tracy almost killed, and he is left to really have to bed down with his neighbours, the Colopys, in a show of power against these upstarts, the Dundons, who have joined with the McCarthys, their cousins, and who have created a force to be reckoned with, that they had the audacity to lure Kieran Keane and Eddie Jr. To that meeting, and to carry out that double cross, and to, be proud of it, essentially. That was their calling card, wasn't it?
Yeah. We see it again in many, many years later. They're still at it to some extent. They're always kind of looking for a plot to get involved in to double their money, whether it's to I suppose take the money off one person and then charge double for someone else to not do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't see why anyone would go into business with them, to be honest.
Yeah, it's seen as sort of their modus operandi now, the double cross, isn't it? They're definitely good at it. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.